Hello and welcome back to another unscripted impromptu video on stuff to do with OSR and also stuff to do with D&D and maybe a bit of Pathfinder. And you know what, I like White Wolf and I love A World of Darkness and everything, but at the moment I like talking about OSR and D&D and Pathfinder because that's where my heart lies, though I love the other stuff too. Anyway, that is a bit of a go on. So let's talk about what I want to talk about this week. What I'd like to talk about is adventures and how they've changed throughout the years from OSR versions of D&D, that type of OSR feel, because I've had people say when you say OSR that can also mean Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Yeah, it can, but I think most people when they say OSR, I say most people, I think a lot of people will probably think of old D&D and old clones of D&D, but you're right, you can have other different OSR style games as well, of course you can. Anyway, so the older D&D OSR style games and those original games, the adventures that came out for them, like In Search of the Unknown, or if you look at the adventure anthology of B1 to 9, In Search of Adventure, my copy's from Drive-Thru RPG, it's not an original, but it has multiple quests in it. If you look at these, this book in general, it's full of maps and dungeon crawls is what it is, because that is older D&D, was a lot of dungeon crawls. And even if I look at the adventure anthology for basic fantasy, there's a lot of dungeon crawls. There's a heck of a lot of dungeon crawls. It's dungeon, and there are some outside maps as well. Of course there are. There are maps of villages that people could visit. Of course they could. It wasn't all just dungeon. But it was heavily based on you're in a dungeon. Well, it's Dungeons and Dragons. Of course, there's going to be a dungeon, but there was a lot of it, and that's how it was until. And this is my belief and my understanding of it. Until, of course, when a big game came out, not a big game, but a big module for the game, which was Ravenloft, which made it a bit more roleplay for a lot of people. I know the original Ravenloft, some people acclaim it as changing D&D from being a lot of D&D's dungeon adventures to suddenly there's a lot more role playing around what was Strahd doing and what was he doing with the girl and what had happened in the curse and everything like that. Now I'm sure you could have done that with a lot of other games, Palace of the Silver Princess as one example. However, I think Ravenloft codified it into being more of a mystery, and it's a good module. I mean, it stood the test of time. Of course, it's a very good module. I think it's one of the best modules out there. I've run a very short one-shot of it, like over 3 hours, which didn't do the story justice at all. The original Ravenloft, not the newer one of 5e. I haven't run that. And one of my friends has that, and you're very welcome to run it if you want, Andy. But anyway, I digress. The original Ravenloft changed the scape of Dungeons and Dragons, I believe, to be a more of a story-based storytelling. Like, it codified it to make it more storytelling, but there was nothing stopping you making any game storytelling. There's nothing stopping me right now pulling the Adventure Anthology 1... Oh, wrong book. Hang on, this is good, I got the wrong book. But, looking at... the first adventure on the first page, which is literally Gold in the Hills, it's called, and it's about 3 or 4 pages. There's nothing stopping me making that into a huge adventure and doing background characters or anything. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying, like, Ravenloft made the story a bit more deep. And even older adventures like Expedition to the Barrier Peaks, it was a big dungeon crawl and weird stuff had happened and aliens were about and everything. But I think it became much more story-centric when I think Ravenloft changed it, and please disagree with me and educate me if I'm wrong there, because I may be, but for me, I think I agree with some other people who have said I think Ravenloft changed it, and it made the adventures a little bit more, well, story-driven as opposed to just adventure, because if you read the OSR primer and things like that, it is like it's less about your players having a big backstory, isn't it, the OSR, if you read it? It's not about making a huge backstory for yourself, because your character might die. It's more about, you making a story for yourself, and your group makes the story. That is what I feel the essence of OSR is. It isn't that the Dungeon Master's got this whole epic campaign. That can happen. Of course it can happen. There's nothing stopping that happen. But it's the group will make their own story and their own adventures and make things happen along the way and things like that. Like with Keeping the Borderlands, my group, I added it so there's a princess that the governor's daughter, they had to rescue the Castellan even from the keep. They had to rescue them, so they rescued her. Then they wanted to poison the keep lord, and they wanted to steal the captain of the guard sword, which looked like a magic +1 sword. Then they ended up smoking him out and then burning down the inn in the keep in the Borderlands. And none of that was written in a story that it should happen. It was what they made happen. And then they ended up having to run away from the keep because they were wanted. And I'm sure you've got stories like that similarly as well. Similarly, however you say it, as well. And where the players make their own story. And they can do that in any version of Dungeons & Dragons. I'm not saying that. But that's where OSR was mainly primed at. Open world. A lot of open world. Here's a set out dungeon, but there's a big open world. Whereas I find the newer versions of the system has a lot of backstories for all the NPCs, and this is that person's motivation, and this is the other person's motivation. Tyranny of Dragons, here are lots of different NPC characters, and you need to study them and research their backstories. Well, you should if you want to make the game as good as it can be. So you've got multiple characters. This is like there's a council in Tyranny of Dragons of people, and there are multiple people that I need to really realistically remember if I want to roleplay them realistically and know their motivations. And I just can't remember. There's about 10 maybe. I can't think of something. There's a few that I've got a full-time job. I've got kids. I've got a wife that I want to spend time with. I don't have time to research all these characters. So I'd like a little brief synopsis, and I look at it before, but I don't have time to look it all up. So that's why I think maybe I gravitate. Maybe it's an age thing as well, but why I gravitate towards a quick dungeon crawl. Let the players make up what they want to do, and I find sometimes the best adventures you can have are in those spaces where you don't expect it. It's made up. The players have suddenly gone off the rails. They've done something. They're robbing a casino or somewhere. They're robbing a bank like that. The players in Keeping the Borderlands, they were casing out the bank. It's not in the story. You expect them to go to the caves of chaos, don't you? But they're doing impromptu things, and that's where I think the gold lies in all versions of Dungeons and Dragons. And whilst later editions like Princes of the Apocalypse, which is Temple of Elemental Evil re-released for 5th edition, later games like that, and Tyranny of Dragons, or the Storm Giants adventure, they have a lot of backstory, and I think that's good as well. They have a lot of that. I think that is the difference, is that the story has gone overloaded. There's so much story behind it, and there's less scope for the players to go off and do their own thing. They can, again, there's nothing stopping anybody in either version of the game, OSR older school or newer school, from going to the other side and doing like OSR players doing a structured story. There's nothing stopping 5th edition players going off the rails. But the way they're both presented, I think they both pivot towards different styles of play, and I think that is just how it is, and I like that. But I suppose my thoughts in general were that I feel that the older schools of D&D, like and this I've spoken about it before, the Evils of Ilmar, which is a little campaign setting, and it's got dungeons in it. Of course, it's got lots of dungeons in it because it's OSR, but it's got a freeform hex crawl. And you just go about the place doing what you want to do, and and there's a lot of scope just to make it up. There's backgrounds on some of the main players in there and what they're up to, but it's not really heavily drilled into you, and you can make up a lot of it, and you've got a lot of freedom. And I think that then ties into the video I've made recently, the last video I made, about why I feel OSR is easier to run. And when I say OSR, I mean it in a D&D OSR style. I think that's easier to run in general than newer styles of game. It's not just the rules and having to remember the rules and remembering that disengage in combat if you don't want to get hit by an attack of opportunity is an action and then they can't do anything else for the rest of the turn. Or remembering, this is 5th edition, or remembering that wanting to do a perception check or an investigation check is an action and then you can't attack somebody in 5th edition and things like that. Or remembering Pathfinder, forgetting that you have to raise your shield to block, to let your shield absorb a blow for the fighter. Things like, I don't have to remember that in newer editions. All I've got to remember is, do you want to do you want to hit someone? Shall we minus a roll to that because you want to do a special maneuver which might cause a condition? And it's just the ease of the freeformness of it, I feel. And again, there's nothing stopping you throwing rules out the window with newer editions. And again, I like newer editions. I like Pathfinder. I like 5th edition. I play them to the cows come home. Absolutely love them. I'm just saying, from a guy who has got kids, full-time job, doesn't really have a lot of prep time, It's easier for me just to run old OSR or Castles and Crusades. It would be very easy for me to run. But I want to run these newer games because I've got to admit the newer games have nice options. They've got brilliant character building options. Who doesn't love building a character out? I mean, a lot of people, even I do. I love sitting there with 5th edition game. Oh, I'm going to build a wizard this time, and he's going to be a divination wizard, a diviner, and he's going to see the future and affect dice rolls. That's cool. Who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want a thief that can stab people with psychic blades and nobody sees that they were ever there? Who doesn't want a fighter that absolutely blitzes people with attack rolls and things like that and can make 2-3 attacks per round? Of course, that's exciting. That's nice. But again, from an ease of ruling and an ease of combat point of view, OSR trumps it for me. It just does. For running it. And I'm saying that for running it. I'm not saying it for anything else. Anyway, I've gone off tangent here because I was talking about adventures. So my point is about the adventures. I think all editions have great potential, and like the Abomination Vaults for Pathfinder is actually a bloody good dungeon crawl. It's a big ass dungeon crawl, but the players can go back to towns and whilst they explore the dungeon, so there's role playing opportunities back at town. Then they can go back to the dungeon. Then they can go back and try and sell some loot and upgrade their weapons. Go back to the dungeon, and then there's little quests to have at the village and things like that. It's not just you're stuck in a dungeon all the time. I think the Abomination Vaults would convert nicely for Pathfinder into an OSR style game, actually. But games like Princes of the Apocalypse and Tyranny of Dragons, they do require more work, and I think I am aware some of the videos I make may sound like they're denigrating newer editions or it's too much work. I don't mean it like that. I mean it like I appreciate newer versions. I like the detail they go into, and they're trying to do more options for newer generations of people playing the game who are used to growing up with video games with lots of options like Skyrim and loads of options to build your character. Not just Skyrim, that's the one that came off the top of my head. And they're trying to cater for that. And I love it, and I'd love to play it, and I like to run them too. But I'm just saying, again, these older versions, Castle by the Sea for Basic Fantasy, or the Adventure Anthology, or In Search of Adventure, the anthology, the original anthology of adventures for old basic D&D. These are great, and you just need to flick through them quickly before an evening. You've got an adventure, and because often in an OSR, the adventures make the game themselves so much, because there's less of you're not worried about following the story and your character's backstory, you're just worried about what's happening in front of you. I think it makes it just very enjoyable. Anyway, thank you for listening to me rant again. Thank you for commenting if you do comment on the video. And it's all great. So have a good time, and do remember, I love Red Dead Redemption. It's my favourite game. Bye-bye.